Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is May 12th, 2024. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. Also want to thank Justin Green for his Binky Brown comic, which Andrew R. Lenoir, our guest today for part two, wrote an article in the Revealer. And boy, did that blow me away. Andrew, what an amazing article. And it's so good to see you back. Where in the heck you calling in from?
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm calling in from Red Hook, Brooklyn, and it's lovely to be here.
So we talked about a lot in part one, and I really appreciated that. There's a Nassim Taleb quote I wanted to
Mm.
start off. Games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses, but we can tell who a hero is and who is not. My friend said, well, villains don't think they're bad. They want control. Heroes want freedom.
Mm.
Maybe just talk about, Andrew, a little of this idea of hero. You know, we know about Joseph Campbell and the hero with a thousand faces, but you've tackled some amazing topics in your writings, like Justin Green, H.P. Lovecraft, Thomas Merton, Rasputin, Robert Anton Wilson. It's endless. I mean, do you consider these guys heroes? And what is your idea of this Nassim Taleb quote? You know, games were created to give non heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses.
I mean, it's a rich quote for a number of reasons, and I think that I have a pet theory that this explains a lot of the popularity of modern video games and that sort of thing, and that it allows us the escape. But when it comes to the question of heroes, I can't help but I can't divorce the idea rather from the classical cult of heroes, where that literally you would go and there would be a temple to Hercules or to figures of the noble dead in that sense, kind of something on par with saints. And so I think we end up carrying those with us in different forms, like depending upon what resonates with us, and like I guess sort of that sense of fellow travelers. The notion that you feel somebody else is striking on the same questions that you have, or maybe even has arrived at answers you were looking for, and that those people become heroes in the sense that they've lit the way ahead of you or fought the battle ahead of you.
Wow, that's so cool because I would consider Robert Anton Wilson a fellow traveler. He's the supreme Groucho Marxist.
I actually just found a wonderful Marvel Presents from the 70s that covers Robert Anton Wilson earlier today. So he's been on my brain as well.
Oh, how cool. And so to continue on this Nassim Taleb, a little, Gregory Bateson, anthropologist, said, if the criminal gets caught, does he go, whoa, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? Or does he go, oh, I did something morally and socially wrong? So, along with this idea of heroes and villains, does punishment work?
Does punishment work? Oh God, it's a good question. I think we've been trying to answer that one for a long time. I'm not certain if I have the answer to that one. I'm fascinated by the question of punishment and whether or not it does a good for an individual or for society. But in terms of whether that could be right or justifiable, I mean, I suppose it really comes down to the question of who does the punishment. No, it's not so much that we don't deserve to be punished, but who will be the one to cast the stone, who will be the one to do the punishing. And I guess ultimately it comes back to us in some ways. it's funny we talk about heroes and villains here because one of the historical figures I find absolutely fascinating is Maximilian Robespierre, and just the notion of his public term. One of the public terms was the uncorruptible, and the notion of being like completely pure. And I think this really ties into the notion of the road to hell being paved with pure intentions. Where the great irony of Robespierre is that he leads so many to the guillotine, and then he himself is guillotined. So I guess in a sense, we punish ourselves. Like that's kind of where I guess the poetry in that is that you end up creating the systems by which you are punished, or the standards by which you're punished.
Really good, Andrew, and it reminds me of Hafiz, the Persian poet, has this great poem about how the jailer drops the keys to the jail cell in front of the prisoner's door,
Mm.
and then the prisoner just picks up the keys and lets himself out if he wants. So it's like almost sounds like a Andy Griffith episode with
Hmm.
Barney or something, but I mean it is this road to hell paved with pure intention. Wow, that's heavy. I have to think about that. So yeah, Utah Phillips is uh, folk singing labor activists, and he
Mm.
said anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people. Who's entitled to make the rules?
I think I always confused myself with I'm referencing Slavoj Žižek specifically, or one of the other people he was referencing. If you've read Žižek, it gets a little confusing. But yeah, I think this often comes down to the way he phrased morals versus ethics, which I think is an important, or it was an interesting framing for me when I was younger. Which the notion that ethics are principles that one keeps to oneself versus morals are how the rules that guide how we treat other people. And I think that if we're going to tie this into anarchism, then like we can really only ever strive to control our own behavior. And I guess this is the notion of self mastery,
Yeah.
is that one is in control of what they say and what they do. But to use an example from Zizek, the example I've always found interesting is of Don Juan from the Mozart opera, in which he is faced with all of his wrongdoing and given the opportunity to change, and refuses to, and accepts eternal damnation and his punishment. Going back to the previous question, uh, because in Zizek's framing, it's the most ethical thing to do is not to change, not to shy away, even in the face of eternal damnation.
Wow, that's good. Don Juan. Well, that's beautiful. You taught me a lot because I love Zizek in a way, but I'm not well versed in him. But I've had two encounters with him one on one, and
Oh wow.
they were really funny and fun because he's more of a Beckett person than a Joyce person. So we
Mm,
just sort of duke it out like who's better, and it says like who's better, Steve Reich or Philip Glass, it's or
mm.
Beat Hard or Zappa. It's like these stupid things where people pit two people who are close just so you can get a discussion fired up.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
he was just walking on the great thing about the Venice boardwalk is these people just walk down the Venice boardwalk and you can just zoom your bike like I ride a bike, just zoom your bike right up to him and start talking to him. And
Mm.
and I went up and Zizek and I just got into it. We had so much fun. But his handler, which was some student from UCLA, kept trying to push me away. Say, okay, that's enough. And Zizek was into it, because he wants that, grinding kind of dialogue.
Oh,
So,
absolutely. I feel like he's one of those guys. You get him started, it would be difficult to stop.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And so this is funny because when I went to the etymological root of the word freedom, it
Mm,
said kind of what Utah Phillips says, giving oneself one's own laws. So that's what
mm.
he says anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people. So the basic question is, what does freedom mean to you now? But I'm going to set it up with two quotes. T.S. Eliot said, freedom is only truly freedom when it appears against the background of an artificial limitation.
Mm.
And McLuhan, loving T.S. Eliot, morphed it into, how are you to argue with people who insist on sticking their heads in the invisible teeth of technology, calling the whole thing freedom?
Mm.
So, any thoughts on the lines? But basically, the question is, what does freedom mean to you now?
I mean, so going back to etymology for a second here, I find the notion of the liberal arts very interesting because
Yeah,
it's not in the sense of liberal or conservative. It comes back to the notion of like libertas, like being free, and that the
yeah,
idea being that the liberal arts are the things that a free man would need to know,
yeah,
and that idea of I mean, actually, the notion of this against made up rules is kind of fun to think about. But just the thought of what are the things that one needs to operate in the world, and what are the capacities within which we can better navigate ourselves. Because freedom is ultimately about being able to pick and choose, and like to some extent to know which rules are real and which ones aren't, and which ones are quote unquote made to be broken. I guess.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, that's good. And then, but what does freedom mean to you now?
Freedom to me now. Let's see. Freedom to me now. Freedom to me now is to do what I would like to be doing, to pursue that which I'm passionate about, and
Yeah,
I think that that is the real ultimate joy in life. No, is to spend the time pleasurably, but also in that sense of doing what is the heart's will to do, which is a little poetic, I suppose, but that we find ourselves drawn to particular work, and I think in my experience almost everybody is just something that really drives them, and the ability to pursue that freely is freedom.
yeah. It's beautiful, Andrew. It's like you anticipated ESP right into the next question. But I got to go back because I never asked this question anymore. And you implied it when you taught me this whole thing about liberal arts. What's it really mean? It's not liberal as opposed to conservative political thinking. And I that's what I studied in the University of Michigan, liberal arts. But so in this idea of being free, why are most artists liberal?
I mean, I think there's I'm reminded of Stephen Pressfield's excellent book, The Art of War, when we're talking about this, where what he specifically talks about is the artist versus the fundamentalist. And I don't necessarily mean to imply that about the notion of conservatism as a whole, but there is a quality to which, when one is always looking backward and thinking that the best is behind them, there is like they were reaching towards something that has already happened. When the word is written, what's the purpose of writing new words? And
Yeah.
I think that that's kind of at the heart of the whole thing, that there is something still to be discovered, that there is a place still to go, that we haven't reached where we need to be yet, that is more connected to original creative creation.
Yes. Stephen, the Art of War. Stephen, how do you spell his last name?
Pressfield, I believe Pressfield. He wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance, and a book about the Battle of Thermopylae, whose name is escaping me, possibly The Gates of Fire. But he also wrote several very inspiring books about the creative process and writing in general.
Very good. But you said he wrote a book called The Art of War?
Sorry, The War of Art. I
The
flipped those in my
War
head.
of Art. That's amazing. I think I just found that book. Because, yeah, I'm doing this research project on art and war. And I went, wait a minute. Because the Art of War is that other guy
It's
from
Sun
years ago.
Tzu,
And
yes.
this is the War of Art. I think I
Hmm.
have that book. That's amazing. Okay,
It's very
so
fun.
yeah. So, what was the tipping point? Because you're basically your three things are you're a bookseller, a historian, and a journalist. That's your three callings, pretty much.
Pretty much. Yeah, that's pretty fair.
Okay, what's your tipping points on each one? Where did you go? What came first? Journalism, like writing? Were you told us this amazing story about the books and your grandmother got rid of them, and it's like that's sort of like the tipping point. You already kind of said the tipping point to be a bookseller or a book lover, a
Mm.
lover of the physical book. And but you can go into it. You just sort of walk us through what are you studying in high school and college that you go, oh, that's what my calling is. Where's your tipping points?
Oh, it's actually it's funny. It's one of those things where I think it's actually that this is such a natural fit that it was one of those things where it was staring me in the face, and I fell into it like a comfortable old shirt a little bit.
Yeah, yeah,
Where so let's see, I was a arts and semiotics major in college, having come from a background in playwriting and fiction, and just being really stimulated by all of that sort of thing. I'd been a local reporter for like the paper out in East Hampton, New York, where I grew up, all throughout high school, and then I went through an MFA program in nonfiction writing at Columbia, and I have heard something said where if MFA program, if medical schools had the same outcomes as MFA programs, there would be some sort of congressional hearing about this. And not to speak too ill of my own experience necessarily or from my own institution, but there is something about. I read an interview recently where they said if you want to be a writer, my advice to you is to get a notebook and the day job, and I would recommend that to younger writers as well, because there's just so much self exploration that needs to be done that can't be taught in the classroom. So
yeah,
sort of feel the need to divorce that slightly from the rest of the question, simply because I think that creative calling can't be taught or pursued directly. It kind of has to become a process of learning to let it out of
yeah,
yourself, which isn't necessarily the most helpful thing to hear at first, but I think that will make sense to people who are in the process of learning that, and to like
yeah,
get out of their own way and to make the work. Um,
exactly. Yeah,
and with that in mind, there was a bit of a learning period for me. I was a speechwriter for a bit, for several different outlets, and folks. And the less said about that, the better. But it's interesting to be on the other side of it, and to go from having been at times intentionally a ghost writer to being a present one. And I think that that's kind of interesting on that front. In terms of the history angle, I feel that that's the one we haven't covered yet. I've just always been, I believe it's Robert Penn Warren who coined the phrase, a student of history in All the King's Men. But that notion of, I think there's this conversation that's been happening. There's all of these events that have been going on, and it's about realizing where you are in the journey that we're all having, but also that everything has come out of something else, and sort of seeing the beauty and the ephemerality of that. And that also drives my passion as a bookseller. It's on the one hand, it's the writer in me enjoys finding the individual stories in the past, and the bookseller in me enjoys finding the evidence. And these two uh, have a marriage that works in my individual life rather nicely. And yeah, I find that all of them kind of, I wear different hats at different times, but it feels like a flywheel that keeps me going.
yeah. But to walk us through, I mean, that that incident with your grandmother in the books was really beautiful described, and but at some point you're going to use bookstores and go, "Oh, I can do this." I mean, is there sort of a tipping point where you go, "Oh, I can resell books," or I can sell books? Because did you work in bookstores and then say, "Oh, now I can be a rare book dealer as opposed to a bookstore guy?"
Well, so that's actually the funny thing. I walked into a rare bookstore the summer after my freshman year in college, and it literally was a case of my mother telling me get out of the house and find a job because it's you're old enough to be doing that on your own. And I ended up going into town, and there were two bookstores in town, and one of them was a more run of the mill bookstore. And that's not to knock that. I love every bookstore I go into. I personally try to buy a book in most bookstores I go into, just because I mean, I have a problem, but also I love sharing that with the community. Um,
Beautiful. Yes, support your bookstores. Beautiful.
but then in this particular case, I ended up going into Glenn Horowitz Rare Booksellers in East Hampton, and I walked in and I had my middling 18-year-old resume, and I asked if they needed somebody for the summer, and they asked me how much I could lift. And yeah, that was kind of my start. And I the first couple weeks I was put to work in the basement, moving stuff from one side of a building to another, that kind of a thing. And I distinctly remember a box of Ezra Pound books collapsed on top of me, and I literally was beaten up by Ezra Pound. uh, but I fell in love with it really quickly, and I mean there were really two moments that stuck with me where the way I describe it is that once you realize this world exists, it's hard to go back. It's difficult to forget. You always remember, and that's what drew me back. Ultimately, was the nagging sense that this is there, and I know that it's there, and I know how this, not to call it a game necessarily, but I know how this works. So that is always what drew me back. And there were two moments. One that first summer where my manager at the time, Jeremy Sanders, he pulled a book out of a box, and it was a book that had belonged to JFK that was inscribed to him from the then Bishop of Boston. And he just pulled this out of a box, and we didn't know it was there prior to him. He just pulled it out to demonstrate this to me. And the fact that this was random happenstance, but this had been held by a president. It was signed in this way, and there were a lot of moments like that. I read Winston Churchill's copy of The Great Blunders of World War II with his annotations. I read Jackie Kennedy's manuscript of her autobiography with the ghostwriter's notes and her notes on the ghostwriter's notes. And as a I didn't appreciate all of this as a 19-year-old, but it was really, very inspiring. And also, similarly, that first year, we had a show. This was 2009. So at the time, it was the 50th anniversary of the Tate LaBianca murders. And my one of my bosses at the time, John McWhinney, had purchased the original crime scene photographs and handwritten trial notes from Charles Manson, or rather, that Charles Manson had made, not from him. To my knowledge, he did not profit from this. But I distinctly recall a moment in which I was asked to open a box, not being told what was in the box, and inside is a painting of the devil staring back at me that Charles Manson made. And I think that was my boss's idea of a joke. Um, but it's these are the things that stick with you in later years.
Great stories, Andrew. I'm open for stories, anecdotes. Beautiful. And you're such a wordsmith. It's really a pleasure. And so a screenwriting teacher told me great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process when you're writing one of your articles, let's say, on Justin Green or H.P. Lovecraft or Thomas Merton? And you're writing your articles nowadays. What role does intention play in your creative process?
I think there's usually an initial attraction in the choice of subject, and I think that's probably pretty close to as I come to intention a lot of the time. I find intention is really something that kind of comes out in hindsight. You mentioned Thomas Merton specifically, and that article I recall writing in the immediate aftermath of the first Trump election. And to be honest with you, I don't entirely recall my entire thought process for writing it. And it has sometimes felt to me as if something that I more or less channeled more than something I wrote.
Yeah.
But I think that is often the case with a lot of writing, is that it doesn't, it comes from somewhere else, and we're just the person that receives it and puts it down on paper in the way that we do. And oftentimes I'm not entirely sure what I meant by some of the things that I meant after I've gotten it out entirely, until I'm shaping it, until I'm reworking it, until I'm really dealing with the it's a little bit of a psychoanalytic process. I produce the work and then I know why I did it.
Yeah. Yeah, Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your potential reader when you're writing your article?
Hmm. I think there's a danger in worrying too much about the potential reader, because that can become paralyzing.
Yeah.
I hope they'll be there when the work is done. I think that's the main thing in that regard. I like to think that there's a quality to which I'm not as unique as I would sometimes like trick myself into believing, and such that if something resonates with me, I can imagine it must resonate with other people. Such that, not that I write for myself, but I write for people of a like mind. For the go back for the fellow travelers comment before, I write for people who I think would understand a little bit of what I'm seeing, or see the same sort of thing that I'm attracted to. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting that. I also had a professor at one point who talked about the nature of criticism. And his specific comment was, imagine you had spent a lot of time working on a penny. You put your heart and soul into making a penny, and then you threw it into a well, and it didn't make a splash. You'd be forced to ask yourself, was there something wrong with the penny, or were you throwing it into a desert? So there is that quality of, you do need the audience, you do need a little bit of the response, a little bit of the feedback, to know that there is a relationship that's happening here. It's not just a one-way street. And I thrive off of hearing little bits here and there, but I also think that part of the creative process, or part of the, going back to Stephen Pressfield and the war of art, but that notion of doing the duty of the service, just doing the work that one has to do. Sometimes it says a ways to be happy requires doing that regardless of whether or not anybody responds at all.
Yeah, amazing. So, like Huntington, uh, Revealer, um, the mental floss, do you pitch to them, or do you write the article and then say, "Hey, I've got an article. Are you interested?"
Usually I pitch, more often than not. Sometimes I'll have an article more fully fleshed out. In those cases, I'll pitch a couple different places with that sort of a thing. But
Yeah.
I think you learn kind of early not to get overly invested in something until there's an outlet for it, in that sense. But these days, I take a lot of notes about all the different things that might interest me, and I find that that's very productive.
Yeah. Also, you're saying, feedback's good, but like on YouTube, you can get people commenting. Articles sometimes get comments, so it's a little different than a editor or a fellow writer. It's the consumers giving you feedback sometime, and I mean, I tend to always go to these big articles that I'm dying to read and immediately just go to the comments and see what the normal person says first, But it is interesting how that whole thing has changed. There's less editorialship allowing us to see the letters to the editor,
Hmm.
that
That's
area.
true.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was gonna say, one of my favorite parts of, I'm a comic guy, so like one of my things, I love finding the old comics letters. And one of the things that's really funny is that you'll find like old George R. R. Martin letters in a lot of comics from the 60s and 70s, or in like fanzines and stuff like that, because he's just a very precocious young guy in New
Yeah.
Jersey sending letters to everybody. So I think that I approve of letters to editors being preserved and published. One thing that I will say, though, is that in the era of social media, the thing about comments on articles is, I find so often people aren't really talking about the articles. They're talking about the stuff they want to talk about, and I
Yeah.
think that comment sections are, so on the one hand, I'm thinking off the top of my head of the New York Times comment section, where they'll block comments for some articles, which I don't think that's necessarily right. I think maybe we should be able to see what's happening just to even have a picture of the reality of a situation, perhaps. But you will also. I'm just thinking first off the top of my head of Reddit, where you can end up being in the comments the whole time and never actually read the article. And many of the
Exactly.
people who are commenting have not read the article. And
Yeah,
now we're just fighting about our preconceived notions, about our positions, about
yeah,
our camps. And
yeah.
so I think there's room for both. I think both are important, but I think some of that comes from the sense of isolation that's present in modern life and the way in which it creeps out into the equivalent of the town square, which is the comment section of any like local place or online article. And in some ways it's valuable that we have that. Perhaps it's necessary that we have that. But something about the immediacy. I question the whether this is, I don't know. Not to say to go back to our liberal versus conservative thing or progressive versus conservative thing, but
Yeah,
I do wonder sometimes if it's better or worse than it used to be
yeah.
in that regard.
Yeah, we in the McLuhan world, we say it has services and disservices. There's
Hmm.
definitely disservices to it, and there are services. So it's that's where our job is to suss out what are the services and disservices. So McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness, like knife and fork extends our teeth, shutter and a camera extends our eyelid, and maybe even non-tangible like religion or philosophy extends consciousness. What does the writing utensil extend for you? Whether it's a pen or a keyboard, when you're writing, what humanness is extended with the writing utensil?
Hmm. I mean, in some ways, I guess we're talking about presence. Maybe I think that's where I would go with it. I know Plato talked about writing as an extension of memory, and specifically of reading as a replacement for natural memory. But I'm also finding myself thinking of Derrida and the notion of the trace, and just that there's this quality of I exist right now, but I'm not the same I that's speaking when this sentence is done.
Yeah.
But when I write all of that down, I can look back at it in a way that's artificial that I wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And I can see my essential self written out. I exist if I write in a way that I didn't previously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, and there's this Kundera quote that I don't have at my fingertips, and I wish I did, but it's basically the character takes on a life of their own. Is that over romanticizing, or does that happen to you? Sometimes when you're writing, it takes on a life of its own.
I would say that that's accurate. It's funny because I'm having the experience right now of writing some fiction for the first time in a little bit, and I have been writing my way back into a story that I forgot about for a while, and I've been reintroducing to myself to who is this character and what are their flaws, what are their goals, what are their motivations. And there's this quality of being able to view a character like a chess man that is very instructive and very inspiring. And also, I had the example in a writing session the other day where I asked myself, is this character smart enough to know that this sequence is a trap? No, probably not. And as a result, the trap then had to play out. It wasn't about whether I wanted that for the character or not. It's that no, these are the circumstances, these are the principles, this is the truth of the world, and he's just not prepared for it. So this is what's going to happen.
Yeah, wow. And then another, I'm gonna flub the quote a little, but Bertolt Bertolt Brecht asked Charles Lawton, what are you doing acting? And he's going,
Mm.
I'm showing people how they could be or might be or what they want to be. And that was pretty amazing because I do know this is accurate quote as Igor Stravinsky says, most people don't know what they like what they know.
Mm.
So that's sort of this thing and what is writing, doing? What are the arts doing? The theater, the film, or the book doing? I know when Bert Guido Pontecarvo made Battle of Algiers an important film.
Hmm.
Is what does your film do teach people? He goes, how to make a film. Now, Bush's cronies used it as a training film and the Black Panthers used it as a training film. It's like one of those perfect kind of in the middle. And so this idea of how do we form aesthetics, I lay out the 3 T's of music, my friends say, are technique, theory, and taste. So technique, you've learned how to write. Theory, structure, grammar, rhetoric, and all that. How does one acquire taste?
I think the only solution for that is to read and to read voraciously,
Yeah.
um, because there's just no replacement for knowing what you like on an innate personal level. Um, yeah, it's just it really, you start to see techniques for things that you like. For instance, something that I learned only through a lot of reading and a lot of exposure is I love lists.
Oh my
Give me a
God.
good list, a list of things all in a row. They're all, and I have to find out why they're connected. I have to hear the rhythm of it. I love a list, and I never would have known that from my own writing in 1,000 years. But that's just from a lot of exposure to reading, and yeah, it's one small example, but
Really good, Andrew, because 2 seconds ago when you said Derrida, I thought of my friend Jay. You've got to hear this interview with Andrew. And then Jay just gave a presentation on list making.
oh,
And
so funny.
and it was really intense because I'm a major list maker. And my joke is, you make a list of everything you got to do today, and then you lose the list and you got the day off. but but the next day you make a new list, and the first thing you write is find old list. So I spoke with Michael Apted 40 years ago, and I said, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? Most people don't know Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922, but in the 80s it flourished because of MTV, to the point where even Marty Scorsese says, I cut my films faster because of MTV. So
Mm.
Michael Apted said, because we've learned to take in information faster. So I asked the question with the bias. Can we literally learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
I'm inclined personally to believe it's the second. Uh, but at the same time, I'm not 100% sure. I'm not sure if you've encountered this, but there's the line about the wine dark sea in Homer, and people have questioned whether or not the color blue existed in antiquity. Now, I confess right now, I don't know that off the top of my head whether or not that's true. But I suppose there's the possibility for expansions of consciousness or for our own ability to rapidly perceive more. But I do think that there's a trade-off that takes place with that, and I think there have been tests that suggest we only have a finite amount of willpower, we only have a finite amount of discipline, and I think that that's something that we lose with information overload. But I also think I think we mentioned this last time when we were talking the book The Shallows, which suggests that the overabundance of information in the internet age has reworked the human brain from being an actual like a recall system to being more of a filing system where we know where information is stored outside of our heads. And so we don't remember the information so much, but we remember where we would find it again.
The brain has been rewired because of the internet. What did you say? Because of what?
Because of the internet connectivity of the internet, we've
Of the net.
just
Yeah, of the
of the net
internet.
itself.
Yeah, a recall system to file system. Oh, that's totally me. I've got notes everywhere in paper, and
Hmm.
people like use your computer to do that. I said I can't. I'm too set in paper in front of me. It's just finding the paper when you need
Oh,
it.
same here. I only started keeping a paper calendar, and that's been life changing.
Yeah. Um, so really the hidden question there, Andrew, is it literally possible for humans to multitask?
Mm. In my experience, I have found that I can only fully focus on any one task at any given time, but I do find that my unconscious brain will be chewing on things in the background, and that sometimes I can come back to something I haven't been innately focused on, and I'll find that it has fermented or continued on in ways without my immediate attention. But other than that, I mean, this said, my wife is an excellent multitasker. So
Yeah.
this might just be a personal thing on my own end where I have a lot of difficulty juggling too many things at once. I think that there's a limited amount of me to go around in that sense. But I mean, that might just be my personal experience.
Yeah. But Andrew, I'm going to fast forward to the question, what's the most significant difference between men and women, physical aside?
Oh man. It's funny. So my maternal grandmother, being Mother's Day, I'm thinking about this, was a a school headmistress for many years, and her answer to this, I remember her telling me this at the table, and I recall at the time not thinking it was true, and I still don't necessarily think it, but I think it's interesting, where she said that little boys will inevitably pick up sticks and play with them as guns or as swords, and little girls won't do that. And I'm not 100% sure that's true. I have a very young niece. We'll see where that goes with her, if she'll pick up a sword or a gun or not. I did play with toy guns as a child. I had like made sticks into them, so that's an interesting thought there. I don't know if there's any innate differences in my personal experience. I have a sister who's very close in age. I spend quite a lot of time with my wife. I think about this, and I think that maybe there's just the degrees in which like we're encouraged to behave differently from young ages, or encouraged to think of ourselves and our relationship to others differently, that might then infer other things. I think there's a capacity with women to listen more, but that's not necessarily an innate thing so much
Yeah.
as like necessarily something that's trained. Or similarly, uh, I don't know. I wasn't necessarily the most like prototypical little boy myself, so maybe I'm not even necessarily the best person to answer that question.
Well, Andrew, you did good because I thought the first thing when you said that my wife can multitask, I do think women probably can multitask because they're giving birth to the baby and running the
Mm,
household and then listening more. I think that's an immense skill of listening. But and it's true, but you get into trouble. I had to stop when Me Too started. I had to stop asking that question. People would go, "Won't go there," you know.
mm,
And now I brought it back because I like when people go, "There is no difference," but there is, and we know. And I think what you said was, for my essay I'm just writing, "Can Art Stop War?" That's its main focus is on matristic, which is matriarchy. A better word than matriarchy is it's matristic. Women don't pick up sticks and turn them into guns. God, that's the guy Matt Groening who did The
mm,
Simpsons. Be Life in Hell. He has the mom is out there and says, grabs the toy gun from the binky and says, "I don't want you playing with war toys." And so she takes the gun away, and then the next scene is him looking in the yard for a stick to use it as a gun. Just what you said. I mean, you described that cartoon that Matt did in your own life. So, really good. So, what's more important, conviction or compromise?
quite a shift there. Okay,
Quite a
let's,
shift. Well, I gotta tell
quite a
you, that's
shift.
the oldest I got a lot of my questions from the great writer Christine McKenna, and that was my
Mm.
first question, like, 40 years ago. I started, "Oh, that's a good question." I start asking people. Yeah.
I think you kind of can't have one without the other on some level. If you have one without the other, you've become lost in some way.
Yeah.
Where you need to know your convictions enough to know what you actually want, and compromise enough to be able to get it, and also to be able to live with what you've Yeah, I think it's about a balance between the two, and
Yeah.
and some of that comes from maturity. It comes from over time learning to live with other people. I guess that's the real thing: is learning to live with other people makes you evaluate that question differently over time. I think because I think I might have had a very different answer to that about getting closer to 20 years than I would like.
Yeah. You've accomplished a lot. How do you rate these three elements, luck, skill, and ambition? What played the biggest role, second and third?
Oh, I mean, I've always been somewhat of rather like not necessarily unambitious, but I've had my own ambitions, and those ambitions have led me in the directions that I've gone. So I've known that I wanted to write, and so I've continued to write. I've known I wanted to be involved with books, and so I've continued to be involved with books. Those are not necessarily everyone's definition of ambition, but if some of the other things had mattered more to me, I do wonder sometimes. Uh, Now, luck, huge role. No question in my mind that I think luck plays a far greater role in all of our lives than we'd like to let on or believe. It's because it's just such an uncomfortable thought. But you know, pure example in what I've already said. If I hadn't gone to the one of the two bookshops in town that I went to, if my mother hadn't told me to go the day that I did, if they hadn't actually needed somebody that particular summer, I'd probably be doing something different or a shade of difference on this. I don't know
Yeah.
that I would have been presented with the existence of this world that I love being involved in.
Yeah.
And that's something that's one of many things that jumps out to me in terms of luck. And skill. I think I've had some innate skills, but most of them have been learned and worked on the way. I think I would go with I didn't trip myself up enough in some places. That's good, and I've continued to allow them to be things to build off of and learn. I do periodically find myself looking back though, just going like, okay, I did not have it as figured out as I thought at that age, and I can't help but wonder if that's the inevitable process of aging is to look back on oneself in those lights, because it's one of those where I go, oh, I was a little dumb at 18, I was a little dumb at 20, I was a little dumb at 22, 24, 26, 30. Oh God, am I still dumb?
That's the great Zappa song, "Dumb All Over." He
Mm-hmm.
said,
Mm-hmm.
"If we were if we're made in God's likeness and we're dumb, then God must be dumb."
I mean, if you looked at a platypus.
But you tackled a lot there. That was good. And my thing about that is I'm always wanting to change my questions or willing. And for years I asked, is ambition based more on fear or joy? 80% of people would say fear. And
Mm.
then Friedkin, director of Exorcist, wrote, in Hollywood, skill and luck have nothing to do with it. It's all ambition. Which is, people shift the words. When I give them those three words, they might go, it's persistence. It's purpose. It's other than the three I give. In luck, you really nailed it because I think you're an example of this. Gary Player, the golfer, said, the more you practice, the luckier you get. So,
I, yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that because well, this is not a good example. Anyone listening at home should not take this as medical advice. But if you were to like buy the lottery ticket once, you might not win. You would have to keep going to keep. You have to keep playing in order to have the opportunity to win. Don't play the lottery, folks. I don't want to. I don't want to
yeah.
encourage that.
But it reminds me of Warhol. He says, don't worry about what people think of your art. Just keep making it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's an encouraging thing. But and you sort of said that earlier, you got to get knee deep in that swamp muck and just do it. And that really leads to this risk question, which I want to ask you is, Leonard Cohen says the only way you can sell a concert is to put yourself at risk. And if you don't do that, people know. What role does risk play in your creative process?
I mean, there's a quality when you write things that well, there's people who say that you should write things that scare you, and I've experienced that at times as well. But there's a really raw quality to anything that you care about. Where if it's dead to you, if I don't care that you could tear it apart in front of me, I probably don't care about it very much. It's very King Solomon. It's
Yeah.
the baby is brought in front of you, and if you can be cut into pieces in front of you, you're not the real mother. So there's that quality where when it's alive, when it's something that you deeply care about and you present it out, uh yeah, there's the real reality that it could be torn to pieces in front of you, and you will be scarred by that. You'll be wounded by that, but then you learn and you continue, you pick up the pieces and you keep going. It's the alchemical solve and coagula, that's the dissolution, the putting back together again, which I also think, for all of my aspersions earlier to MFA programs, I will say that that's also the inherent thought behind a workshop format for writing. That everything gets torn apart, everything gets destroyed, everything the faults are found in every piece, and in doing so, we learn to look for those things, we learn to find those things, we learn to think a little more critically ourselves as we go. I think that the balance is about not letting that overcome the innate core expression.
Yeah. Really good, because also you anticipated this. Louis Leo Bersani did a study of Mallarmé's poems, The Symbolist. He said the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. I'm
Hmm.
curious if you can suss that out. I don't even know what that means. I have hunches, and I've asked this for years now. What does that mean? But the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Which threatens the writing of poetry, sustains poetic composition. I'm not sure that I know exactly what that means, but off the top of my head, it sort of sounds like a notion of the the drive to write poetry, specifically in this case, comes from the need to express something, the need to share something that is unique and raw in that sense, but being able to put that into a form that can be conveyed or that can stand as poetry. And poetry being a very, or not necessarily always, but at least traditionally being a somewhat more rigid form, there being more rules around it, that could be perhaps an obstacle to expression, or the sense that things get lost in the translation.
Yeah, that's funny because Gary Snyder said, my task as a poet entails the work of seeing the world without language, then putting that seeing into language. That's
Absolutely, that's
that,
very
that
relevant.
that's so T.S. Eliot said that poetry is outing our inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
I've always worked mostly in images and scenes. I find where I'll kind of have like a flash of not quite necessarily something out of a movie, but an image of something. Sometimes there will be sound. Sometimes there will be like a specific motion quality to it, or maybe there will be even lines that go with it. But I'm often working off of these kind of, oh, not quite fragment and amber, but yeah, go picture that as you will. It is sort of like trying to turn that into more motion and to breathe a little more life into it.
Beautiful. Two of my film heroes have this mantra. George Manupelli says, ignore yourself. Jonas Mika says, there is no self expression. And Cecil Taylor says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Is art making more self expression or more your vehicle for whatever technologies, environments, and culture is dominant?
I think that's ultimately an unknowable question, and I think that will keep you up at night as a creative person, or it should probably,
It
but
should keep you up. That's good.
it should keep you up at night. But I think for the most part, we can't become too bogged down in that question, because I think that is a great way of tying oneself up in knots. And I'm there. This is, I'm paraphrasing somebody's quote, but the notion that like the self being basically untortured by self-expression, that like the ease of self-expression, of just being oneself easily, is joy, is happiness, is all of these things. Uh, Such that I think becoming too focused on what all of one's influences are, or how much one's responding to these other things, I think the beauty often becomes when you find those things in the work after the fact. But yeah, because I think so much of it really is about learning to get out of one's own way and just let the work happen. I think we all spend a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of excuses and various other things to try to get back to doing the work when we're not doing it.
So well put. Can art making be egoless?
I think in moments. I think at its best in moments,
Yeah.
yes. I think there are definitely times where it's egoless. It just, again, those are the moments where it just happens. But I can't imagine being completely egoless over the course of turning those moments into a finished product that is then released into the world. Or I can in some instances, but I'd have a hard time believing it every time. I think
Yeah.
by the time you got to something that you had to fight for it to see the light of day after it existed, like that's the part where I think ego has to come in, because otherwise you wouldn't fight as hard.
Couple things. I was dying to in reviewing part one. It was so fun and enlightening. Andrew really taught me a lot. And I wanted to say at one point, John Cage said the purpose of he learned from his Zen teacher, the purpose of music is to soothe the soul and
Mm.
make it susceptible to divine intervention. you know, which sounds really good. You sit there and you let it, you're like Cecil Taylor. This stuff just comes through. Well, if you study Cecil Taylor, he didn't just bang at the piano randomly. He knew what he was doing, but it sounds like he's banging at the
Mm.
piano randomly. And that's the beauty, is if you really study it, it is like unbelievable. But most people like, that's horrible. And then Paul Schrader, wrote Taxi Driver, said the role of the artist is to attempt to sell out but fail. Which is, I'm glad you laugh. It's funny, but it's got a little twist to it, because it's sort of sound like most of my artist friend goes, yeah, my art's so pure that I attempted to sell out, but I failed. That must mean it's pure. It's like,
Mm.
that's like, give me a break. Who's determining? Go ahead. Any thoughts on any of that?
I mean, one of the things that jumps out to me there is a bit of advice that I think Alan Moore gave at one point, which is the notion of basically taking a pre-existing story and remixing it in some way, or just reinterpreting parts of it. So
Yeah.
I think to try to sell out and fail can also mean, I mean, it's just such a funny thing to come from the writer of Chinatown, because Chinatown is in some ways just such a classic noir story until it isn't.
Wait, wait, wait.
And
Schrader didn't write
oh,
Chinatown. He wrote Taxi Driver. That was
oh,
Robert
Taxi
Tom.
Driver.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. There we go.
But they're
Well,
they're they're
yeah,
pretty dang close, dude. I
but
know it.
also going back to neo noir in that sense,
Yeah,
that things
Neil.
are
Yeah,
almost following along with a provided formula until they aren't. And
that's it. Yeah.
there's something that really resonates with people when, oh, I thought I knew where this was going until I didn't.
Well,
And that it keeps things fresh, it keeps things interesting.
that's really well put, because Umberto Eco says you stand on the shoulder of giants and you take it further. So,
Hmm.
and then back to T.S. Eliot, it says the mature poet steals, the immature poet imitates. And I told my friend that, who's a really great filmmaker, and she goes, well, I guess I'm an imitator. That I go, no, you're not. She just didn't want to say I'm stealing, because it
Hmm.
sounds bad. It doesn't sound right to steal.
Well, it's the
You
whole
know,
idea of making something your own, right?
yeah,
You take it so much that like no one could accuse you of stealing it because you're doing it your own way.
yeah. That's Frank Zappa says genius is when you steal and they can't tell who you stole it from.
Hmm.
And that's kind of interesting too. So it is reinventing, that's McLuhan's main thing. Reinvent with new metaphors and new questions, you know. So Lewis Carroll says, I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Have you believed in any impossible things lately?
Yeah, I try to believe a number of impossible things at any
What
given
name
time.
one? Name one, Andrew.
I mean, I think a good one is just I'm getting this from William Walker Atkinson, but I've been trying to keep it in mind more lately, and it's just the notion that one can and will do the things.
Yeah,
Just that I can and I will.
yeah,
Because again, if we're being rational, we probably, there's times where it's not the case, where it's not possible. But to
yeah.
believe the irrational thought that it's possible to do something keeps you going, keeps you working, keeps you productive. And I think
Yeah.
that's a really simple one. But we get a little more floaty.
When you've been creative for many years. Tell me one major element of your creativeness, your Andrewness, that stayed the same and one that's changed.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, at one point, I have a long-standing historical fiction project I was working on. It's in some stage of it needs resuscitation at the moment, but I reflect on this in part because when writing that, I definitely had the experience of I had a structure in mind based off of things that had actually happened, and I told myself, okay, I will not change the things that actually occurred, and the things that actually occurred will be my real structure for. I will get to do the arabesques and the creative innovations on top of this framework. And I think in some ways that's reflective of looking for easy answers, which is not to say that's always true, for
Yeah.
everybody. That's not to say that would be the case, but I think in my earlier years, looking for some of these formulas, looking for some of these quick fixes was really about like finding a way of what was ultimately getting around doing the work.
Yeah.
Where I reflect on the fact that I did manage to. I've written several manuscripts over the years, but it was really only in the last few years that I've really like dedicated myself to a daily practice of writing and just how different that feels.
Yeah.
And just sort of, yeah, I would say that that's in my own creative life. One of the big differences is moving away from thinking this is the way it has to be done to simply doing it, and that realizing that second one, even if it doesn't seem to necessarily be going anywhere, is the more important of the two exercises.
Yeah. Really appreciate your honesty there. Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I guess an example of that is just in my own personal life. I have a sense of, mess blindness, or the lack of multitasking, the lack of like, I let the little details get out of the way, and that's not to turn this into I've somehow learned to master the little details, because I haven't necessarily. There's still some that I miss. But this does encourage me to go back over my own work, to think a little bit more like clearly about what I'm doing. And it's not to suggest that we should all necessarily second guess ourselves all the time,
Yeah.
but just that little bit of let me take a moment, let me reflect on that, let me just have the mindful pause before action, is something that I've turned into a strength as a reaction to that.
Yeah. Fill in the blank. Anger can be a productive emotion when.
Mm. I have two connected thoughts. One was when you don't let it control you, and the other is when you don't let it hurt anyone or like hurt yourself.
Yeah. Did you learn that from the Quaker upbringing? What did the Quakers say about anger?
Hmm. Off the top of my head, I'm not actually sure what the specific doctrine would be, but I think it would come down to the notion of like effectively that's it becomes your responsibility. The notion that like these are about anger is something that's internal. You feel anger. Someone else causes anger in you. But it is a an internal thing that you can choose to make external. And I think that there's that quality of, and I noticed this with the when I think about, are there good or are there bad people in the world, and why do so many of the people who are like, quote unquote the worst people, why do they so often have had like such rough starts to things? And I think that there's a quality of, we let ourselves behave badly, or we let ourselves go down certain things if we think we haven't been given a fair shake, or if we feel like poorly treated in those ways. And that's why can't we poorly treat others, or maybe I'd start to feel better if I like took this out on other people.
Yeah.
And I think realizing that that's just spreading the thing, that's the internal hurt, that's the like, that can start and end with you. It doesn't need to be something that's spread further than that, and that maybe that's real responsibility in that regard.
Yeah. Well put, Henry. In fact, it's funny because for years I said, can anger be a productive emotion? And most people would go yes or no. I mean, George Clinton, Parliament Punkadunk, he says all emotions can be productive and non-productive. But then someone said, well, flip it. And so they could have to elucidate a little. Anger can be a productive emotion when, and one guy finally says, when I asked it that way, he goes, it can't be a productive emotion. So he
Mm,
somehow reverted back to the way I used to ask it, which was like amazing. Because then I was wondering, well, maybe I shouldn't have changed the wording, you know?
mm,
Um, I asked my friend who wrote comedy with Robin Williams, can satire be destructive? He says, that's the job of satire. But if me or you do a cartoon in a certain country and they kill us, some people think dying is destructive. So Swift compared satire to a mirror in which people could see every face but their own. What's the function of satire?
I mean, okay, so I go back to the notion here of like the funny bone a little bit. The sense that like when you get hit on the elbow, it's just that, oh, it's that weird feeling. And I think that that's the role of satire a little bit, is that when it hits something in the way where where you laugh about it because it made you laugh, but it's kind of an uncomfortable feeling because you're
Yeah,
laughing about this thing that you didn't necessarily know you were conscious of up until that point. And I think that, yeah, the satirist points, they indicate, they make you conscious of things that you previously weren't consciously aware of, by making you find the humor in them, and then in some cases that humor turns into self-reflection.
it's a Zappa line. Watch the Nazis run your town. Now go home and check yourself. You think we're singing about somebody else. That
Mm.
is, well, what's the function of laughter?
I mean, I think in some ways it might just be a release valve.
Yep.
It's because you can get hysterical laughter as well. You can get laughter that fills the silence. You can have all these sorts of things, but it does seem to me to just be a way of expression, a way of release, a way of letting something out of the self.
Yeah. And my mom taught me, or when you laugh or you cry, like you cry, it's a release valve again. It's an
Hmm.
emotional, but she says you're actually getting toxins out of your body through the tears.
Mm.
So it's even more than just emotional, it's physical. And you touched on this. Well, Gurdjieff said laughter is the reconciliation of yes and no. And you kind
Mm.
of touched on this duality or binary. McLuhan loved to quote Steve Allen, behind every joke, there's a grievance.
Mm.
Any comment?
Behind every joke, there's a grievance. Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think that there's it's the particle of sand that becomes the pearl. It's that we. I guess this takes us back to the question of crying versus laughing, because I get to the notion of, like, so we use the word weep, and one weeps, but a wound also weeps. It is literally the release of a toxic thing, or something in that sense. But laughter is turning that irritant, that toxic thing, into something that is apparently round and smooth and joyous, but maybe it's just another way of delivering that same nugget of the toxin, which uh, I could go places with that metaphor, but
I love the gap is where the action is, but
yeah,
that's
well,
the, that's the resonating interval. Beautiful. And so there's a line, Andrew, that goes, you create what you resist. Not you, but one creates what one resists. Bob Goldthwait, the comedian, morphed it into you are what you hate. James
mm,
Joyce said, it's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve. And Louis Buñuel nailed it. He said, thank God I'm an atheist. So any thoughts on this? You create what you resist. Again, it's like one creates what one resists. Any thoughts on that?
one creates what one resists. I mean, yeah, I mean, well, on the one hand, you go looking for enemies and you'll find them. I think that's generally pretty true in life. And I think we also we describe we throw these words out there, we throw descriptions out there, and when I say it, I might be thinking of one group of people, but then an entirely different group of people hears those words and attaches themselves to it. I have now we have become enemies. Where we have like now become in opposition, perhaps when I didn't even mean those people at all. That's another example of this kind of thing. But yeah, I guess it comes down to what one is most passionately resistant to, what one allows what itself to be most irked by, and what one turns into their enemies as well. Because many people go throughout the day without being bothered by whatever my pet peeve is, or whatever your pet peeve is. But we could, in theory, let that accelerate until this is the sole driving thing in our lives. And
Yeah.
you know, I don't know. I don't love it when people on motorized scooters go down the sidewalk in our neighborhood here in Brooklyn. I know logically these are people making deliveries that are on timetables. I still don't love it, but I could be somebody who like goes out and organizes the whole neighborhood to harass these people that are driving on the sidewalk. And I could also begin to understand how somebody begins to go in that direction with something like that as well. So I don't know. I guess it comes down to a question of whether or not we choose to be happy.
Boy, you really touched on me, because the Venice Boardwalk was created. They created a bike path because many years ago a bicyclist killed an old person. So
Oh
they go,
wow.
look, we got to make now the bike path does not have the motorized vehicles. The walking boardwalk has these people shooting down there really fast, and they're for rent. And I said, the cops have got to take a net, swoop it onto the person riding the motorized, give them a $5,000 ticket, and say, you can never come on this boardwalk again. And I'm like, this is not, they're going to kill a kid and an old person. I know, I've spent a lot of time down there. Totally agree with you. It's out of hand. It's motorized scooters, and now they're motorized bicycles. Ah,
Yeah.
rant, rant, rant. But you're right. How do we suss it out and work out a solution? It's not us versus the motorized vehicles. It's us and them versus the problem.
Mm.
So how do we solve it? It's like, good luck. You know? And I'm a bicycle rider, and I ride my bike on the sidewalk because I don't want to be hit by a car. But people go, don't ride your bike on. I look at, I'm riding slow. I'm very aware of every person. I'm not one of those speedsters, but most bicycle riders do go on the street because they want to ride fast. So there's so much gray area in there. Sorry to rant out.
Oh
Okay.
no, no, totally.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's 5 Alan Watts questions just off the top of your head in a couple words. 1, who started it all?
I mean, the first thought was God, so we'll go with that.
2, are we going to make it? Good answer.
uh,
It's back to the laugh, right?
back to the laugh. Back to the laugh.
3, where do we put it?
Wherever it will do the least harm and people will accept it, I suppose. Like where it belongs.
Beautiful. 4, who's cleaning it up?
I mean, do your best to leave it better than you found it, I guess. But otherwise, be polite to whoever that person will be.
5, is it serious?
Yes and no.
Yeah, very good. Okay, we got about 15 more minutes. It's really been fun, Andrew. Here we go. A couple more. On what occasion do you lie?
Oh, sometimes I would find that I veer into I what's this that bit we tell more lies to ourselves in the mirror. I think that actually probably where I find myself in the question of how much I'm lying is really more in the what parts of myself do I allow myself to see.
That's
Um,
yes.
if I had to guess, there's probably more of that than I let on.
Yeah. That is, I really love when people say that. No, I don't want to lie, and I especially don't want to lie to myself. It's like that. Wow, heavy. Can you forget to die?
Maybe. I've seen reports that suggest that's possible. I guess we'll let you know when we get there, right?
Send me an email.
I'll send you an
we'll,
email.
we'll
I'll let you know.
we'll do a Zoom. How do you find peace of mind?
In some ways, by stopping looking for it,
Yeah.
I think that it really comes down to finding the joy in life and recognizing the things that make you specifically happy and just resonate with your essential self. That sounds hokey, but yeah, there are things that make you happy to do that don't necessarily make other people happy, and that if you can find what those things are and fill your life with them, everything else seems to matter a little less.
Really good. If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
This is one of those moments where I'm like, I would probably slip myself some sort of like long handwritten scroll with instructions for various different times, but no, it would most likely, you know, just be the notion of the hang in there, it's all gonna get better
Yeah.
kind of thing. But just I might actually have some reading recommendations. I
There
think
you
that's
go.
one of the things I would definitely do. I would tell myself to read some things earlier.
What name one you would have wanted to read earlier?
Oh, this is not going to win me any friends. My wife and I are currently reading The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, and I've never read it because I've been negatively predisposed toward Ayn Rand from, I guess,
Oh, yeah.
ideological purposes.
Well,
Uh,
everybody is. I
Yeah,
mean,
everybody is, and I'm not here to argue about
yeah,
selfishness
yeah,
or the like, but some of the comments on the nature of art and on like self-expression, and I think are very useful for a young artist to have internalized outside of the politics,
yeah,
because this really is about like purity of one's own will to expression and what they're here to do, as opposed to compromise and as opposed to making those sacrifices for what other people necessarily validate or encourage. And I recognize how that could become a little tricky when we get too far outside of the world of art. But specifically in the arts, I think it's a very interesting and useful thing to keep in mind. Although, again, all things are true, even the lies, and we gotta find
Yeah,
the balance between these thoughts. But I think there's something to that I could have used as a younger creative person.
really good. No, it's really good because it's like American Indians, indigenous, your enemy's your best teacher. And I'm not saying she's a writer. Get over it. But we know that it has this huge cloud over it. Oh my God. If you go, what's your favorite book? Fountainhead's like, ooh.
I
You
don't
sort
want
of
to say that.
you
No.
cringe, but it's like, hey, you read a book. You watch her on YouTube in that interview on TV. She's very articulate and she's a thinking, you know, breathing human. But it would be fun to have Justin Green do the Fountainhead as Blinky Brown.
Oh, I could see that being interesting. I mean, there's some bits he probably would have had a little too much fun with. I don't know. I have comments on the plot of the Fountainhead as well. I could get into it simply because like I don't know what they're thinking with some of these developments. But yeah,
Well, which way should toilet paper come off the roll, over or under?
I can literally check. Hang on. Uh, okay, at the moment it's under. I think we're usually an over household though, so
Yeah.
that might be new. I
Wow.
don't know.
Very good. If a publisher was to release your autobiography off the top of your head, what would the title be?
I did have a title for this at one point. It was had been called Homage to Catatonia. I don't know that that's still the title, but when I was younger, I thought that was very funny.
That's really good. They want to scent the glue in the binding. What smell?
Ooh, oh, the smell of the glue in the binding. Oh, that's good. Let's go with something that has some sea salt in it. Yeah, let's look. It's some salt breeze.
Yeah. What, Andrew, of all people, I would say you would say used bookstore smell.
Now, see, that's an interesting thought because weirdly, most of the quote unquote new book smell is from post linen books. So we used to have linen paper, linen rag paper, and then in about the 1850s, 1860s, we switched over to wood pulp paper. And so when you smell old books, it's a really that it's the age of the lingam in the wood pulp.
Yeah, you would know. That's beautiful. Okay, there, if a statue was built in your honor, where would you want it displayed and what would it be made of?
Mm. I might like it out at the eastern end of Long Island, which is just where I grew up. I spent a lot of time, probably facing out toward the sea. I think that would be nice. And is it a statue of me, or is it just a statue or a monument?
You can, it's your design. You can do it, design whatever you want. It's the main two parts are what's it made of and where it's located. So yeah.
I really like the old Viking burial system of the stone ships. I could see myself being very happy with a stone ship in Montauk pointing out toward the sea.
Beautiful. Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
Something good I've never had that I never want. Good. I mean, off the top of my head, I've heard good things about mangosteen, but I don't crave one at the moment. It's a silly answer, but it's something that comes to mind.
What is it?
A mangosteen, it's a type of tropical fruit that's difficult to come by in the United States.
It's not a mango, it's a variation on a mango?
I think it's a completely different fruit, but it's called mangosteen, all one word,
Right,
and
okay.
I'm told it's good. So
It's
I
good,
don't know,
you
but
never had it, and you never want it, that's good, yeah.
I'm probably not going to seek it out. I mean, if it showed up in front of me, sure, I would taste it. But you know, it's one of those where there are many things in life that I've been told are good. That perhaps it's if they arrive, if they are presented to me, certainly. But I'm not certain that it is my quest in that way.
Well, you know where I got that question is I haven't studied it, but I know about it. NLP, neuro linguistic
Mm.
programming. You know about that?
Yes, yes,
Oh,
Ericksonian hypnosis.
yeah, so you look at, yeah, exactly. That's the best part of NLP. But you, when you ask that question, you watch which way their eyes go, and then you go, "Oh, they're that type or that part." I just
Mm.
said, "Well, I just take the question out of the context of NLP and ask it." So people was like, "Well, if it's good, I want it," but it's fun. Johnny Carson said, "Tell me something good you never had and you never want." He says, "I don't know, but when you find out, tell me."
That's a good answer.
If you were in a vat of vomit up to your neck and someone threw a bag of shit at your face, what would you do?
I'd like to think I'd have some sort of a remark, but I don't know. Thanks. What do you say at that point?
Very good. What's the cultural shift you see developing today that inspires you?
I think there is more of an acceptance of people going out and doing things on their own, and that the supplied answers aren't necessarily the correct ones. And I think that has come from a place of seeing a lot of established wisdom, like not necessarily pan out over the last 20 years or so. But I think that's inspired a lot of people to start seeking out new arrangements and new ways of moving forward. And that is inspiring to me. Is just the notion that there are many ways of getting to where people are trying to go, and that they find different ways, they find new ways. You know, Jurassic Park, life finds a way, and in that I find myself continually inspired rather. Ever so often, I'll hear somebody's story and I go, "Oh, that's a new way. I hadn't thought about that. Why didn't I think about that?" And just uh, it makes me excited that more people are finding new opportunities and different opportunities.
Yeah. Very good, Andrew. And just to let you know, when you go with your hand near your ear, your voice cuts out a little.
Oh,
So,
okay. I won't do that
but
again.
yeah, but it's funny because now like in future Zooms, like when you wanna say something and you don't want them to really hear it, just go, "Well." Well, we got most of it. It happened a little earlier, and I was like, "What's happening?" Because you don't know. Sometimes servers go out a little. I mean, Zoom has improved so much now. When we first started 4 years ago, it was like there
Mm,
was always problems. Now it's like it feels like we're in the same room talking to each other.
absolutely.
Okay, a couple more and we're done. Okay. What's a question that remains unresolved for you?
Mm, that's a question that remains unresolved. I do have ultimate questions about what happens to us after death. I have theories. I have questions. I have you know inclinations, but yeah, no, long-standing questions. It's one of those where I wonder what happens immediately. I wonder what happens after a bit. I wonder what happens even after that,
Yeah.
because you're dead a long time.
Well, the Tim Leary thing is if you learn how to lucid dream, supposedly your physical body is out, but your mind keeps working for like 6 to 7 minutes.
Hmm.
So if you learn how to lucid dream, you can sort of conduct your path for a couple minutes. But who knows?
Yeah, very Tibetan Book of the Dead, very much
Yeah.
into that kind of line of thinking, and maybe there's some interesting thought to have there, or there's even there's the Catholic vision of you're in limbo or you're in purgatory for a while, burning off some sins, and then you go up to heaven. There's the Summerlands, there's this, there's that, there's the Mayan and Aztec underworld, which is really horrifying, but it's interesting to think about.
That's well, two things. If you ever get out here to Venice, I want to take you over to my bookstore, my favorite bookstore, Angel City. And
Hmm.
it's just like used books and used records, but It's like
Sounds great.
as soon as I walk in, I always feel this must be what heaven is. For me, this is heaven. I just spend time there. I meet people there. We have a ball. But Rocco who runs it. He literally died and he's sitting there. He
Mm.
had to, whatever, something happened to him. He went to UCLA hospital. 10, 20 minutes later, he wakes up and the nurse says, dude, you were dead. And you came back. And he says, I didn't see any white light or anything, but he knows that she was kind of accurate. She saw some something. But it's also the joke. The guy goes to hell and he peeks in and the devil's standing there and he's not let him in yet. And he peeks in, he goes, you've got used bookstores in hell? And the devil goes, that's all we got.
Mm.
It could be reversed to heaven either way. But
Either way,
take anything you love or hate and say, oh, you've got, blah, blah, blah. So how has books shaped your behavior? Because you write about books, you're a journalist and historian, and you deal and collect books and revere them. How have books shaped your behavior?
well, I started keeping a daily diary more or less after getting more and more into books, and I guess that's sort of kind of relates to like my notions of writing as presence, and that's just one of the thoughts that I've had there is just the notion of like reading people's diaries and really thinking about why do people keep these documents. It's sort of an odd thing to think about in our increasingly digital world, but just that like the notion of a commonplace book, for instance, or something that someone would carry around, they'd write down their insignificant thoughts, their things that they thought were interesting and that kind of stuff, and just that notion of being something you had to be more intentional about. I think is something that it informs it for me, but also it makes me think about preservation differently. It makes me view
Yeah.
technology differently in a lot of ways. I mean, we've just had this major solar storm this week here in the northern hemisphere, in New York. I think that was it was all over the country, all over the world? Question mark.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Maybe all over the world. Uh, and there was talk about whether or not this was going to make electrical transformers blow up, or if this would do damage to computer systems and that kind of thing. Well, not to be too anyway about it, but no storage system has been tested as much as paper. That paper, you write something down, like we have like the childhood notes of a Viking, like written down on their paper, the little cartoons of a longship, and we're 1,000 years later, people are still giggling over this child's drawing. And I don't have like the first stories I wrote on my childhood MacBook, or like because it died.
Yeah.
But so I think about that really differently, and I wonder about that also with like my sister was an avid photographer when we were growing up, but she was doing it all on digital cameras, and now I don't know where any of those photos are versus if this
Yeah.
had been done with a physical form.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think about it like that.
Beautiful. It also, just saying writing as presence reminds me of Carl Andre, the sculptor, says sculpture as place. It's
Mm.
like, that whole word as is such an amazing thing. Writing as presence, sculpture as place. Really good. And Thornton Wilder said, art is confession, art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time.
Mm.
You've laid your cards on the table for over 3 hours. I'm not insinuating you haven't already answered this, Andrew. What's it really all about for you?
What's it really all about for me? I mean, I think at some level I mean, hmm. I heard a thought recently that has resonated with me as I think about some of these things, which is that at the end of at the end of time, at the end of one's life, you will have to make not necessarily, or rather, you will have to answer to your God, which will be yourself,
Yeah.
and just sort of the notion of I hope this isn't too morbid, but I do live with some of the notion of like, what are the things that I would be truly unhappy about not having completed or not having done?
Yeah,
And I try to let that guide like my sense of what's important.
yeah,
Because we don't know how much time we have. We don't know how much time we're getting. And I think that really meditating on and chewing on that question of what are the things that you would be most disappointed about at the end of time not having completed, that like then what your work is in some
yeah,
ways from that.
yeah,
So I
yeah,
guess just like, and a happiness becomes about how easily you're able to like live up to the expression of those things, or how unimpeded you feel in the expression of those things. So I think the pursuit of happiness, of truth, and of beauty, all of those things is what it's all about. But that really becomes about recognizing what are the most important things and how to do them without torturing yourself over them. They should be joyous, they should be pleasurable, they should be about sharing with others and about finding the balance between those.
really beautiful, Andrew, 'cause, Frank Zappa said, "I'm a failure, but I'm not a miserable failure." And it's like, really, we're all failures in a way, and we all succeed, and then how do you like, once you succeed, you're like, "Well, now what am I gonna do?" So when you
Mm,
fail, you're like, "Well, what am I gonna do? Go moan and groan, or am I gonna go, 'Hey,'" the great line in The Wake is, "First," and I always get it backwards, "First we fall, then we feel." There's
mm,
no gibberish there. That's real lines. But I always go, "First we feel, then we fall." So I think you one of them goes first, but it really works both ways. You fall, then you feel, because that's what the wake's all about, is you fall down, then you get back up. That's what life
mm.
is. But, I also wanna tell you about what happens to you after you die. I forgot. My friend said, "What happens to you after you die is whatever you believe happens to you after you die." So everybody can, like, write out, "Okay, this is what's gonna happen after me I die," and then then you hand that to the guy, "Hey, this is what's supposed to happen to me."
I mean, that would
Yeah,
be pretty nice. I kind of like
yeah.
that. It's an interesting interpretation of the Book of the Dead being written on mummies.
Oh, is that it?
Well, I'm just thinking about it. They had their instruction book for how to deal with the afterlife written into their own wrappings sometimes. So it'd be interesting
Oh
to think
my
of, oh,
god.
you've pre-programmed your afterlife experience.
I didn't know that. That reminds me of, like, T.S. Eliot and Joyce. They put the instructions how to read their stuff in the stuff.
Mm,
Supposedly, like, 4 quartets or Prufrock is that there's the directions on how to read it, and the wake is constantly going, "Oh, dear reader," there's
mm,
little hints on, like, what you're supposed to be doing with this stuff. Or what is it, and in a
mm.
whole, what gives you the most optimism?
Gives me the most optimism. Weirdly, the sense that like all of this will continue regardless of what I think about it is both a terrifying and distressing thing, but also an inherently optimistic one.
Yeah,
Because even in the moments where I start to feel depressed, or I start to think that like we're going in the wrong direction, I do have the solace in knowing that I ultimately don't know where any of this is
yeah,
going, and I can kind of surrender to the wonder and to the awe of, oh, it's all getting so different.
yeah,
There's that quality of perhaps that difference is the point. The novelty is the point.
yeah. Surrender to the awe and the wonder, yeah. It's like, no, we don't you don't have to be comfortable with knowing the answer. It's like, what's the question?
Hmm.
What's it's we want w it's the ability to know and not know, you know? But we think, "Oh, now I know. I'm safe. I get it." And that's like, well, It's always in flux. It's always kind of changing. Because actually, the first question is, what's the best thing for a human being? And Wilhelm Reich said the best thing for a human being is another human being.
Mm,
And the last question is what they asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life: what gives you the most optimism? And he said, other people.
mm.
So, it's sure been fun spending this time with another person, especially because it was you, Andrew. Thank you so much, man. This was really fun, and I learned so much, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jerry. I've had a lot of fun as well, and these were some really interesting, far out questions. I feel like my brain's been expanded just by contemplating them. So thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Really cool. And even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Yeah, well, thank you.